feel free to interrupt and ask questions, make use of the chat, and do all of those wonderful things. I have four bigger discussion questions that I will offer at the end, and I'm hoping to give about 5 to 6 minutes of Zoom breakout room interaction, and then bringing us together to share out some of the things that we've noticed or learned or that are hoping to integrate into the future. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and give folks an opportunity to see this presentation. Can folks give me a thumbs up if they're able to see it all right?
Yep.
Fantastic. Excellent. So I just called this Not Quite White because it's a fun play on words, and I love a good pun. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is the concept of white fragility, white women's tears, and really, where do we go from here? As Murph said, I'm a student currently. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Oregon. I'm in my 4th year, my 4th of 6 years. So I'm really excited to finish my coursework and move on with my internship. And really, one of the reasons why our lovely administrative group here asked me to speak on this topic is because I'm involved in a lot of intersectionality focused opportunities. And so that involves Black identified, Latinx identified, Indigenous identified folks, and really the integration of where we are currently as a community and where we'd like to go. It's with an understanding that we have the best of intentions and that sometimes we just make some pretty significant missteps. I'm really hoping that tonight can be characterized by openness and vulnerability, and hopefully that'll be reflected in some of the stories that we get to share and that I will plan to share with you as well. So moving to the first idea, we're going to be covering quite a bit today. So first I'll go through an overview. We'll talk about vocabulary, we'll do some reflections and more. I'll talk a little bit about history. We'll set a precedent for the future. I'll talk a little bit about tools and skills. So what do we do and where do we go from here? And then finally, we'll have a discussion. So here looks very simple. It's only 4 things, and I assure you it's quite a bit of 4 things. So we'll get started right away. So this first piece, let's chat about our overview. So we're going to first start with the concept of transformational learning. This is going to be the piece that hopefully characterizes the way that we have this conversation. We're going to start with head, which is the logic, cognition, and introspection element. We'll move on to the idea of heart, and this focuses on connection, empathy, and emotion. And lastly, we'll talk about hand, which is action, praxis, and next steps. The head, heart, and hands model for transformational learning is actually also known as the active parts of human presence. The model was conceptualized actually from a very diverse synthesis of literature, sustainable education, transformative learning theories, place-based learning, indigenous learning approaches, and really the intention here is to integrate all of these aspects of self. How do we bring every element of ourself to this journey that we have ahead of us of working towards the idea of becoming anti-racist? Next, we have this idea of intersectionality. So on the image on your left, you'll see that there is a person, a human person in the center, and there are so many elements that contribute to this person. There's culture, class, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, sexuality, ability, status, and more. So these are just a few of the many things that affect our day-to-day lives. And then here on the right, you'll see the way that these different elements can actually affect our larger society. So values are the beliefs, philosophies, and principles that drive a group, often associated with religion and often associated with different cultural environments. However, we also see that norms are the ground rules that dictate how people interact, and these are informed by our values. And we also see how culture is the interaction between the two, so the beliefs and the behaviors of the group. So these are the components that we're going to want to keep in mind as we move forward. And altogether, this really reflects the concept of intersectionality. And really the theory of intersectionality is exactly what you see here in this Venn diagram. It's the study of overlapping or intersecting social identities and their related systems of oppression, domination, discrimination, and it was actually developed by Crenshaw in the early 1980s to address kind of double oppression and the concept that women of color in particular were experiencing due to their marginalized racial and also gender identities. But as we know from this lovely diagram here on our left, there's a lot of different ways to experience oppression, or in many ways, privileges. So for example, myself as a Latinx woman, Latinx identified woman, I might identify some dual oppression here with being Latinx and also identifying as a woman, but also in terms of class, I experience a tremendous amount of privilege. My family is considered middle class. I would say that I have not been characterized, nor have I developed a difference in ability, which would also be an opportunity for privilege. And I would say that as I identify as a heterosexual woman, I also would not have any instance of oppression in my sexuality. So this is a wonderful way to understand the ways in which we might experience privilege in some regard and oppression in others. Moving next to the next concept, we're looking at the idea of impact versus intention. And this can be one of the most challenging things to overcome when we're faced with instances where we've harmed someone or we've done an unintended ill. And so this is something that I really like. You'll notice that I really like the cartoon iterations of this, but I'm first going to explain the idea of intention versus impact. So a wise person once taught me that prioritizing intent over impact is actually characteristic of an oppressive culture. And it is because it allows those with privileged identities to center themselves and their intent while dismissing the impact that they've had on those who are of marginalized identities. So I can't tell you how often I've seen people attempt to kind of deflect the criticism of their oppressive language or actions by making the conversation entirely about their intent. And it really begs the question, at what point does intent conversation stop mattering so that we can step back and actually look at the impact that it has had on other folks? After all, in the end, what does the intent of our action really matter if our actions have the impact of furthering the marginalization or oppression of those around us? One of the things that can be really difficult in these circumstances, as we can see here, is that even though it may not have been intentional that this man ran over this other man's foot, it has nothing to do with whether or not he is a good driver, and it has nothing to do whether he meant to or not. The damage is done. Something has happened, this person has been harmed, and typically the best idea to move forward is to realize, how can I remedy this thing that has occurred? How can I make right what has been wronged? And so when we look at these concepts, this is also applied to the way in which we respond to other people telling us, you've hurt me, you've done something, or you've said something that has caused some harm, and I'd like us to talk about it. I'd like us to find a way to move forward together. So let's keep that in mind for us right now as we even move forward into some of these more difficult conversations about how our reactions affect other people. This next concept looks at the responsibility component. And so as you can see, I'll read through it briefly. Racial history in America is not talked about thoroughly, and that's left on kids of color, Black kids who are learning via living and being in Black families as the person who teaches. And you can see here for people of color, they're always constantly asked to educate on behalf of white people. It's like another job they take on. It's always like, oh, I want to know, teach me. And it's like, actually, you could be doing this work on your own. And what makes this so important is that often folks of color are not resistant to talking about their experiences. They're not resistant to sharing their lived experiences. It's when it becomes an obligation or when folks express a sense of entitlement to a person's lived experiences. And it's also when you're asked to speak on behalf of an entire community. And so the responsibility component here looks at, to what extent can we take on the burden of learning about a different community? And I'll use myself as an example here too. Myself as a Latinx woman may not know very much about Korean culture. When I was in high school, I had a number of Korean friends because of where I was located. And I was actually in Salem, of all places, Salem, Oregon. And so when I met my friends, one of the things that I was able to experience vicariously by being around them, by going to their houses, was was certain elements of their culture, taking off my shoes before I entered the home, learning how to accept gifts, learning how to return gifts, learning how to address their family members. These were things that I learned by virtue of doing, by virtue of experiencing. And when I had questions about their holidays, when I had questions about why certain things were, I could ask, and many times they were willing to inform me. But anything beyond that, I took it upon myself to learn, to research, and to ask questions in a way that would allow me to do independent research. And this is important because taking on responsibility for our own learning does not apply the entire burden of learning from our communities and our communities of color, but also to our friends and the people that we love. Something in particular that is valuable at this point is also the notion of white privilege. And something that is reflected here, especially in academia, especially in spaces where we share community with other folks, is that white privilege is really your history being part of the core curriculum, and mine, in my case, Latinx, or in other folks' cases, maybe Black history, being taught as an elective. And so this is such a clear distinction. If I have to elect to take a class about my own community or about my own history and culture, because it's not part of the main narrative or it's not part of mainstream history, that's something to keep in mind. Why isn't it integrated there? If we are a melting pot and if we are a community that integrates so many different lived experiences, where are those experiences lacking? Where are we missing those pieces from our curriculum? So really this process gives us an opportunity to ask questions. Why isn't something included? Where did it go? And why don't we have it yet? So those are some things to keep in mind. Next, we're going to go to some definitions. So this is particularly important as we are discussing different phrases or different vocabulary words that I will use throughout our presentation today. And the first is performative allyship or activism. So this is when someone from a non or less marginalized group professes support and solidarity with a marginalized group in a way that either isn't helpful or actively harms that group. And so an example of this would be, as you can see for Dr. Amber Spry, is when millions of people posted Black squares on their social media and put Black authors on bestseller lists all summer. But yet when we had the experience of the election, or in many cases other more challenging experiences, it is so difficult to see the distinction of whether people are valued for their words and their experiences, or whether they're valued for just the fact that they're saying the right thing. And so really performative allyship and activism looks at doing the walk the walk versus talk the talk, right? So everyone can talk the talk, but can everyone walk the walk is really the question here. And so when we discuss this concept of performative activism or performative allyship, the question we are asking ourselves is, am I following through on the things that I say that I value? Are my actions matching the values that I say I have? And if the answer is yes, great, keep doing it. And if the answer is no, maybe it's a time to reflect and say, how can I make sure that my actions and my values match? Or how can I give myself an opportunity to adjust the way that my behaviors are not reflecting my values? So again, when we come to this experience of action, of praxis, often we find the most satisfaction from our lives and the most satisfaction from our relationships with others when we find that we are living our values and living in accordance with those values. Next, we look at a more complicated concept. So this concept looks at neutrality. And this one has been a little incendiary for a number of reasons, and we'll get to that. But really this concept of neutrality as complicity. And you'll notice that I use a lot of quotes at this point in time because there's a number of folks that said this very statement in a much better way than I did. And really what this says is we must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And this is, this and many other quotes are from folks that, again, are heavily lauded as peacemakers. Another one is if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor, which is Desmond Tutu. Washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Paulo Freire, which is the author of Liberation Psychology. And lastly, Martin Luther King. There is a special place in hell reserved for those who remain neutral in times of great moral conflict. An individual who accepts evil without protesting it is really cooperating with it. And so many of these great leaders that we've had in our future speak to the importance of not being neutral in times where justice is not being done. And really, it can be boiled down to this concept of when you choose inaction, that in and of itself is a choice. Inaction is still an action. And for many of us, the idea of allowing things to passively occur to us is not something that we enjoy. We typically want to be active and utilize all of our autonomy to engage in our life circumstances. And so the idea of things happening to us passively can be extremely challenging. And it also, for many of us, is not in accordance with our values. Most of us like to think as active components and active proponents of our lives, of our relationships with others. And when we allow things to just happen, many times we feel like we have no control and we have no capacity to affect the outcomes of our lives. These things can be incredibly painful and can also create more discord in our lived experiences. This is from a school psych account that I've followed for some time, but looking at, for some folks, the debates and the difficulty with which Senator Harris was being able to speak during the debates and feeling the need to actually say, you know, I'm speaking, and speak for herself and take a pause in that moment. And many women in the next morning, many white women felt like they would have done the same in that experience. They would have also stood up for themselves. They would have also made it a point to be allowed to speak. But sometimes we also find that in some cases, they're actually the moderator, failing to hold white men accountable for their actions and failing to use what little institutional power and privilege that they have to level the playing field and to actually engage folks in a way that is meaningful. And so for many instances of utilizing your autonomy and your power is often utilized to check other people and to make sure that they too are engaging by the same, rules of engagement, so to speak. This is also particularly important as we talk about allyship and supporting communities of color. I'm going to take a brief pause here and see if anyone has any questions or anything that folks would like to clarify.
And if you'd like to say something, please just unmute yourself and pop in.
I had a question about your example of intent versus action.
Sure.
I mean, in the cartoon example you gave, the difference between running over somebody's foot with intent and running over somebody's foot without intent is that the former is a crime and the latter is a tort.
Correct.
So there is a difference. I mean, it's not, the lack of intent is certainly not exculpatory. Mm-hmm. But there is a difference.
Correct. Yes.
That was my point.
Oh, okay. And I appreciate that. Really, the intention component here is as it affects impact. So in both of those circumstances, someone has been harmed. And yes, you're right. In an intentional impact with a car, or an intentional impact with a vehicle, you're looking at a crime. And when you see an unintentional impact with a car, you're looking at a tort. And those two things matter insofar as legality. They often matter in terms of whether or not someone is going to follow up and be supportive or follow up and try to rectify what has occurred. But really the impact component, insofar as it applies in this circumstance, is when we're talking about racism. So for example, if something happens with racist intent and it's something done with intent, that's considered a hate crime if it can be proven. And when it's not done with intent, the harm still exists. And so that's something we often struggle to grapple with, that the harm still exists. So how do we balance our lack of intention and also in some ways our feelings of sadness, frustration, anger, guilt that come up when we harm someone that we care about, while also not utilizing those feelings to invalidate the fact that we've harmed somebody else?
That's an important point. there is a continuum there, and we
Yeah,
can't ignore that.
absolutely. Absolutely. And that continuum is absolutely important to observe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Any other questions?
Sam, we have a quote item in the chat from Carol. You showed one quote about neutrality and you referred to several others. Do you have a resource list or do I need to do some digging to find these? That's a great question, Carol. And at the end of this session, I know Samantha will send me this information and I will include it in our key terms and further reading list.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Carol. I will not only include the presentation, and you'll probably see in the lower right-hand corner, left-hand corner, I have citations. I'm happy to provide my references, and I'm also happy to provide an extra kind of reading list that I've compiled, because these were the resources that really helped me develop not only these materials, but also have been really central to me developing my education and being able to lecture in other places. So absolutely, you have full access to all of those things.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah. Great. All right. I'm going to move us right along. And so we ended here in neutrality is complicity. And the next piece that I find extremely valuable is this idea of niceness. Now, niceness is an interesting one because nice is often a value that we have been given or have been taught, conditioned since childhood. And niceness is usually a pretty valuable skill to have. It's one that folks feel pretty strongly about as, you know, if nothing else, be kind. If nothing else, be nice. And so one of the things that we want to do is not only support the idea of niceness, but also look at sometimes how it can be a stand-in for anti-racism. And so you'll see right here, Layla F. Saad, author of Me and White Supremacy, she states, I think most people would say they don't want to be racist or live in a racist society. But part of the issue is that people tend to have such an extreme understanding of what racism is, and they don't see themselves in that way. They think they are doing just fine because they are treating people nicely, but being nice does not mean someone is being anti-racist. And this is often a painful concept, the idea that just being nice is not enough for me to avoid doing harm. In many ways, that is counterintuitive, and it's painful to confront that cognitive distortion where we're saying, but I was nice, but I was saying something kind, I was saying something good. And while that may be so, sometimes the impact of our words, again, going impact over intention, the impact of our words can be less what we expected it to be, and it can be interpreted a different way. I'll give a personal example for me. When I was in the 4th grade, I wrote a poem, and I remember it very specifically because I used the word eerie, E-E-R-I-E. I had just learned about Lake Erie, actually, and I was writing a poem about how folks utilize boats as a primary method of transportation. And because I was so fascinated with Lake Erie and the word Erie and that play on words, I incorporated it into my 4th grade poem. And the instructor that I had at the time, who I still remember vividly, called my mom in for a conference, and neither of us knew what to expect. And when she pulled out my poem, I thought, oh, wow, maybe she really liked it. And I was very excited in my 4th grade year-old mind. And she proceeded to accuse me of plagiarism because there was no way in which a 4th grader could have known the word eerie. And when my mom asked her to qualify this accusation, she said that, you know, that I was very well spoken for a 4th grader and that I had wonderful linguistic skills, but that there was just no way, that it was impossible that I could have written that poem by myself. And that was such an interesting backhanded compliment in many ways, that, really well-spoken little kid had this great capacity for being able to speak for themselves in class and in their written sense. But the moment that a word was utilized that they didn't believe was congruent with my capacity, it became problematic and it became very challenging. And I remember refusing to write for the rest of fourth grade for that teacher. That was no longer something I was interested in doing. And so there are many different iterations to experience this. I've had colleagues who are, for whom English is their second language, and they've experienced circumstances where they're like, wow, you are so well spoken. Your English is flawless. Theoretically, superficially, a really sweet thing to say, a very kind compliment to get paid. However, the insinuation is that because they're from somewhere else, their English should be broken, or their English should be incoherent, or should otherwise have difficulties with their understanding and their comprehension and our ability to comprehend them. And so this is a perfect example of where we might think a little bit more about how to engage, and why it's so important to think about the things that we would like to say about someone. If we're impressed with their capacity, if we're impressed with their ability, how might we go about acknowledging that without also insinuating that something else was possible there?
Sam, David Morelli asks, is this also microaggression?
It is. It is absolutely considered a microaggression.
We had an interesting session several weeks ago on the good bad binary.
Yes.
And I'm just sitting here nodding my head, because that was probably the session that drew the most questions and the most discussion.
Yeah. And it's powerful stuff. It's difficult because we often, again, if we envision ourselves or perceive ourselves as nice people, the last thing we want to say is like, oh yeah, I microaggress people. I like to do that in my spare time, right? That's never what we'd like. That's never what we go for. And this is why it's so important to think about, wow, well, what was my intention? It's okay to resolve that. It's okay to say, I didn't mean that. It's okay to say that was not something that was not in my heart when I said that. And it's also important to take a moment for yourself to acknowledge that. And when you speak to the person, to enter with this idea of, I'm sorry that I hurt you, because I did say that. I said it. It's not what I meant, but I said it. And those things are so valuable, because if someone gets hurt, if a little kid gets hurt, right, they fall, the first thing that I say to them isn't, well, you shouldn't have been running. It's like, are you okay? Are you all right? Is there something I can do to help you? And then later being able to say, running isn't a great idea when you're next to a pool or something like that. So again, person-centered, a focus on helping the person prior to problem solving the situation.
That's a great point. That right there is almost the how-to.
Yes.
Person-centered versus problem solving.
Oh. You got it, Murph.
Okay.
So that's just a little bit. That's our overview. We've got some great vocabulary down. We've got some great concepts. And now I'm going to move us briefly to history. And so I'm going to breeze through pieces of this because I want to make sure that we have enough time for our discussion. But really what we're looking at is some brief history points that talk a little bit more about our experiences throughout time. And so when I talk about white feminism, it's a very distinct difference from intersectional feminism. It's a difference from feminism that womanism, which is often perceived as the person of color, Black, Indigenous, people of color womanism, which is very similar. But when we look at our timeline, really we look at 1848, which was the Seneca Falls Convention. This was the end of the Industrial Revolution, a focus on white women and suffrage. Then in 1920, the right to vote was issued, but only for white women. So some of our heroes were actually not abolitionists. And this is particularly difficult to stomach because when we think about suffrage and we think about the right to vote, we think of Susan B. Anthony, we think of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and these are folks that really worked hard to get women the right to vote. But what is often missed from that historical context is that it was an intention for white women to get the opportunity to vote. So there's a quote, or there's a description in, I think it was Susan B. Anthony's diary, that they talked about they were wary of creating an aristocracy of sex. And this was utilized to push against the idea that Black men at the time should get the opportunity to vote. And so for many, they proposed universal suffrage, but primarily for white men and women prior to being able to offer that to women of color, men of color, and the like. And it really wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that we'll say the rest of us were given the opportunity to vote. So it was Black women, Indigenous women, Latinx women, and really this was also where men of color were also included in the right to vote. Once we hit 1990, we hit third wave feminism. This was led primarily by Generation X, focused on sexual liberation. And then more contemporarily, we're looking at 2010, which is fourth wave. And really, it's in third and fourth wave that we start to see more intersectional feminism. We start to see more voices of color being included in the extant literature. We also start to see more folks being given credit for the language and for the foundational offerings that they're being able to implement and offer. And this is also where we're getting an opportunity to see that our current iteration of feminism and the ability of feminism to be so successful in the past, the phrase that's utilized is on the backs of brown and Black backs. And so this is so important to be thoughtful about and engage, because of the fact that many of this would not have been possible without the efforts of an entire community, white, Black, brown, and other folks that were a core part of this. So as we move forward and thinking about the erasure in many ways, the removal of Black and brown efforts in order to support the suffrage movement, this would understandably offer an opportunity for some reluctance and some resentment. And so this is where we start to see the development of some of this white tears and like white women's tears, some of the narrative where that comes from. So we'll talk a little bit about that now. So these are actually Instagram Snapchats. So this is something that I find particularly valuable. Sometimes reading about literature, and especially about feminism and racism, can be overwhelming if you're sitting down with a large text. And then there are other folks that are qualified to be doing a lot of the educating. And this is particularly valuable to me because not only is it available to a variety of folks, especially younger folks who are growing, but it also gives an opportunity for voices to be heard in a variety of ways. And so historically speaking, these are some things that are constituted as red flags in conversations about race. And so this comes from Marie Beecham, and she talks a little bit about the different things that pop up when we're talking about race that automatically give people of color pause. And this is almost like the "I'm not racist, but" we're all familiar with that phrase. And these are a few more that we kind of add to that list. So the first one is, I don't think that this has anything to do with race. And the reason why that's problematic is because, of course, in a racialized society, systemic racism has affected everything, literally everything: education, healthcare, the workforce, housing. You can name just about anything, and there is a way in which systemic racism has affected it. If you haven't noticed the role that race plays, it's likely that you've been in a position of privilege. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. Next, we look at the whataboutism. Rachel Cargle, who I highly, highly recommend as an author as well. Whataboutism is used to deflect blame and shift the conversation away from the oppressed group being discussed. White supremacy in this context is exemplified by society's reluctance to ever give exclusive attention to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This can particularly be reiterated whenever we have discussions about, a good example was BET, so Black Entertainment Television. When that came out, there was a huge uproar about, well, why do they get their own entertainment television? Why isn't there a white entertainment television? And really the question about this becomes problematic because you're saying, well, considering that television in general appeals to largely white audiences, what would be the difficulty in including a Black entertainment network? Is it the fact that we haven't thought about this before? Or is it that there's some some value in being able to integrate that into the future, and some value in being able to integrate that into mainstream television. Next, we see, just to play devil's advocate, this is a challenging one because for many folks that prefer a logical argument or who prefer to look at things from a logical perspective, playing devil's advocate can actually be a really helpful tool. We want to see what things look like from a different perspective. And while that is still valuable, it's important to notice when you choose to engage that particular conversation tactic. Playing devil's advocate when someone is reporting on a social experience that they've had, or when they've been microaggressed and similar experiences, actually derails the conversation about race by swerving into these loaded hypotheticals. Well, what about this, or what about that? And really, it really seems as though you get a kick out of putting folks' humanity on trial. So when someone is reporting an issue, an instance of racial experience, and you say, well, just to play devil's advocate, what if they meant it like this? That somehow kind of becomes a moot point. Sure, I'm sure that could happen in a hypothetical future or in a hypothetical other universe, but for this particular moment, this is what happened, and it was clear that this was the intention. Those are the things that we keep in mind, and like we said earlier, placing humanity at the center of our response, wanting to support the person before we problem solve the issue. On to the next couple. So this one is a personal difficulty that I have. So agree to disagree. This is one where when we don't agree on something, and to end the conversation, we just say, well, we're gonna have to agree to disagree. This doesn't resolve situations of injustice. And so agree to disagree is acceptable for preferences like, I don't know, maybe I like peanut butter and you don't, and we're just gonna have to agree to disagree about whether or not peanut butter is valuable in our pantries. But really, when we're talking about rights and ongoing oppression, agree to disagree is no longer a valuable placement to exist at, because it becomes policy. Whenever we're talking about situations of injustice, we're looking at policy, we're looking at laws, we're looking at things that apply to a large group of people, whether it's at the community, state, or federal level. And so these are not situations where we can really afford to just disagree, because there are real life consequences and ramifications. And similarly, kind of going into this idea of denial, a white denial of racism is highlighted by this particular user, and it's like denial of fact. So when someone says, well, that's just not true. A denial of awareness, well, I had no idea that that was going on. A denial of responsibility, where that's like, well, that's not my fault, my personal fault. Or impact, that wasn't my intention. And so again, we're kind of double covering some of these concepts, but really what we're saying here is that there's a number of different ways in which someone's experience can be completely disregarded or invalidated because someone just doesn't understand it or isn't able to engage it in a meaningful way. I thought I saw something pop up for the chat.
Yes, Father Fred said, totally agrees with that. That just kicks the ball down the road and nothing happens.
Exactly. It's a nice way to push things off. And then lastly, in these little pieces, we hear these experiences, or we hear these sayings very often. And so if you find yourself saying some of these things, or if you hear someone else saying them, it's important to take notice. And these can be indicators that a productive conversation is turning into a futile debate. And so for those of you who are interested in learning, for those of you who are interested in actually being able to engage your community, this can be a painful removal of a conversation. This could be the termination of a relationship. This could be the disengagement of someone, and unwillingness of someone to re-engage with you on difficult conversations. And so this is one of the things that, again, many folks of color hear these and they automatically shut down, because it's an indicator that this is not going to be a productive conversation. And to be very transparent, may not actually be worth your time if someone's going to reduce your experience to a whataboutism. And then the last component here is that just remembering that tolerating racism is racism. Again, that niceness as complicity, silence as complicity. Anything that makes space for white supremacy is racism. Being willfully ignorant can also be complicit with racism, and that each one of us has a personal responsibility to acknowledge these instances and also to oppose them. Because again, these silence components, these lack of intentions, like focusing on what our intentions are or focusing on our lack of knowledge, those are all problematic. And the hope is that we can each take steps to eliminate those one at a time. One of my favorite sayings that will pop up a little later, but is of Maya Angelou, where it's just like, do as best as you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. So I'll take another little pause here in the event that folks have questions.
Again, just unmute yourself and pop in if you have a comment or a question.
So I have a question.
Yeah, Sarah.
For people who don't live in racially diverse communities and have never lived in racially diverse communities, do you think, Samantha, it's just a matter of educating those folks, or do you think they don't have any way to experience or empathize with people who have lived different life experiences? I don't know if I'm saying this in a way that is understandable or not.
Yeah, I think I understand where you're going with that, Sarah. My personal philosophy, and this is shared by some theorists and not by others, so I'll name that up front, is that anyone can be taught anything, that we're all capable of learning, and that we're all capable of adjusting our worldviews and adjusting our expectations. So when you ask me that question, my gut reaction is it's about education, it's about experience, and it's about lived experiences responding to fear. That can be one of the most challenging things for folks to face. So when they've heard all of these norms within their community about a particular group being bad or a particular group being X negative quality here, it can be really difficult to combat those. And it can even be difficult to recognize that those are biases, implicit or otherwise, that exist. But what we've found is that when you expose folks to other folks and they get to experience each other in real time, or when folks read and when folks engage others in conversation, that can be mind-blowing, world-changing. It can change perspectives really from one day to the next. So I have yet to meet anyone in person. I've heard of people theoretically, but I've yet to meet anyone in person that was incapable of growth and that was incapable of changing a mindset or changing a perspective simply because they refused to do so. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
It does. Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Awesome, great. So I will move right along to this second half of history. And really what this is, and I'm moving your little faces around so I can actually see what I've typed here, is reflecting on damage. So what happens when we can recognize that damage has occurred? So when we think about this, one of the big pieces that comes up, again, my absolute favorite are these little comics. So the narrative so far has been, I want to hear more diverse stories, as long as those stories don't challenge me too much or make me uncomfortable or fail to center me in the narrative. And for obvious reasons, this is difficult and this is challenging and not at all what we want to support. But really, this can be the experience that a lot of people of color have. We get this interest in our lives, we get these interests in our lived experiences, but when folks get to the point of like, oh yeah, and here's the way in which you or your community or your identities have contributed to that oppression, or how your identities have made my identities struggle in some ways, there is an immediate shutdown of like, oh no, I didn't want to hear all that, I didn't need to know that. And these are the pieces where it becomes very important to lean in, to be willing to reflect and to introspect on the ways in which we contribute to some of our systemic oppressions. Because there is no one that is unimpacted under white supremacy, and this includes white folks. I think often we have so much conversation around people of color and the way that they're affected, but really white supremacy affects white people too. It has unnecessary expectations. It creates problems for the ways that y'all are able to engage with your neighbors and loved ones. And then on top of that, we're not even able to connect in a meaningful way because we have this cloud hanging over us. So there are no one escapes unscathed. under white supremacy. And that's really a key component. Wanting to have racial literacy and racial justice does not just benefit people of color. It affects and really benefits everyone. And so some of the pieces that I wanted to go into next, and this is where it can get a little more challenging. And so I'm going to name up front that these pieces look at some iterations or some reflections on the ways white women center themselves in conversations around race. So this is the white tears component of things. And I will say that even though I didn't write these are things that are often felt in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And so you'll see the language reflects some of that frustration. And so I want to name that up front as something that may be a little bit harder to stomach. But it is important as a way of engaging in the sense that these things are being developed because people of color are having such a hard time with white women and with the ways that white women engage these communities of color. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So the first one is crying, because this is a conversation about white tears and we're going to talk about crying. So the user here, which is Celia Stanton, is, I don't care whether you're crying because you feel attacked or crying because you feel guilty. Either way, it needs to stop. When you cry, the natural focus shifts to you because many folks don't feel comfortable continuing a conversation with someone who is so visibly distraught. And crying creates one of two scenarios. Either I have to console you for whatever happened, and typically it's because you've caused something, you've perpetrated some ill, or I have to put away the conversation. Neither is fair, and both are to appease you, the white person who is not harmed and actually has benefited by racism. And so one piece of this, one caveat that I want to offer here is that crying in and of itself is not the bad guy. Crying is not the problem. This demonstration of emotion is not the problem. It's when the demonstration of emotion is utilized to evade a difficult conversation. And so often folks experience this and they're like, oh, now I can't cry now. And that's never been the difficulty. We are all emotional human beings, and we are all going to have emotional responses, especially when we feel shame, especially when we feel embarrassment, especially when we feel frustration or we feel like we're not being heard. And just like any situation as adults and as we choose to teach our children, just because you are embarrassed, just because you are frustrated, that doesn't mean that you get to completely deny your responsibility of a circumstance. So this is the first component. The second component is redirecting to your trauma, your personal experience. So first and foremost, it's important to name that trauma and mental illness are both very real and should be taken seriously. However, when we have conversations about racism, it's not the time to place the focus on your particular struggles, and they're not sufficient excuses for not engaging in the intentional work of anti-racism. This is difficult because often we'll talk about how, and I'll name an experience that I've had myself. When I was in my master's program, I went to the University of Pennsylvania for my master's program. There was this white woman who was from California. And we were having a conversation about Latinx identity. Now, the clear obvious is that I have some lived experience being a Latinx woman with Latinx identity. And this young woman was a white woman who had been around a lot of Latinx folks. And she made a statement about why a particular phrase in Spanish was translated to a particular thing. And her translation was off. There's no other way to say it. She had the wrong translation. And when I corrected her translation, I'm like, actually, this is what that means. So you may have understood it wrong, or you may not have gotten the right, maybe someone didn't translate it correctly for you, but this is what that actually means. She became very irate with me because she told me that maybe that translation was my experience of the translation, even though it's a different language. And then on top of that, she accused me of intentionally triggering her anxiety by correcting her in class. And so that's a perfect example of this idea of redirecting your trauma. Just because someone experiences anxiety, just because someone experiences depression or perhaps PTSD, all of these being very real and serious mental diagnoses, it's not a sufficient excuse for having incorrect information and then perpetuating that incorrect information. And it's interesting, as the author lists here, because it redirects, it's an ironic redirect, because while racism is also inherently traumatic, dealing with white fragility or dealing with consistent white tears is traumatic. And by recentering the conversation to be around the white experience of these things and their trauma, you're actually contributing to the racial trauma of the person that you're speaking to, the person that's giving you that feedback of like, oh, that's actually problematic, because what you're doing is you're silencing them. You're telling them that you actually cannot accept that feedback and that you're going to respond very severely if you do. So that's another iteration. And it's funny because as I was reading through these, I was like, oh yeah, I've experienced that. Oh yeah, I've seen that too. Oh yeah. So it was so interesting to see some of these parallel some of my own experiences and not realize it until preparing for this. So that's great. The next one is bringing up times when you were a good ally. And this is what I've seen most likely as a justification, almost like a Hail Mary. Like, I may have done this really bad thing right now, but what about all of those other times I was so good? And I've heard this also referred to as the robbing the bank theory of like, I didn't rob the bank all of these other times, and so that must mean that I didn't rob the bank this time, right? That's how that works. And so this can be difficult, but really what it is, it's almost like a look for mercy. So many folks can't think that we can't tell that that's what they're doing, but we can. It's not something that it's not the moment to hear about how you stood up for a Black or brown person. I don't want to hear how inspiring the book you read last month was. And I don't want to hear about that one friend who you noticed did something racist once, because many of the times it's not about what other folks are doing. It's not even about what you've done in the past. It's about what's happening right now. Because just because you've done all of this good work, even people who work to be anti-racist their entire lives can still perpetuate racist incidences. And this is why it's so important to perceive this as a growth mindset. It's so important to know that we are constantly growing and that we are constantly making errors and we are constantly adjusting to make sure that we don't repeat the same errors consistently. And so the more you have yourself on this pedestal, or the more you have yourself on this irrational and unreasonable expectation of perfection, the more you will mess up and the more you will feel unable to manage those mess ups. And so this is particularly valuable when we're thinking about how do we want to become better at not only making apologies, but accepting feedback and accepting opportunities for growth. And yeah, there's some pieces there. I'm sorry you're not just going to be getting a biscuit. That's one of my favorite lines in the whole thing. The next piece is credentialing. This is one that I think many folks in academia and higher education struggle with, because this is actually something that I brought up to Murphy and Father Fred and some of the administrative folks too, that we're reading this wonderful book, White Fragility, and it has so much to offer, but at the same time, there's so much that is occurring because it is occurring in tandem or parallel to the work that communities of color have done. For example, Robin DiAngelo is actually impacted by her learnings from the Black community. And just because a white person develops knowledge, develops literature, develops all of these things in a particular area doesn't mean that their particular mastery is of that area. And as we know, mastery is never something that we can totally achieve. It's something we're always working towards. But when we use our credentials to silence other people's voices, that's a problem. If I, as a heterosexual woman, do my entire career on LGBTQ identities and I silence someone of that community because I don't agree with their experience, I'm still perpetuating an evil. I'm still creating a negative experience for that person and silencing their lived experience, which could be much more rich and much more valuable than any of my literature and any of my research could have ever provided me. And so this is what we might also call as staying in your lane. So knowing that you have a knowledge base, knowing that you have information, knowing that you might even be considered an expert, but giving credit where credit is due, and knowing that someone who's lived that experience is going to inherently have more knowledge and inherently have more experience than you might because of that lived experience. This is also something that can be difficult as a person of color going through the academic process, because you'll notice that you are taught many things from your instructors. You are told that these are phenomena that exist, but you may also find that it's incongruent with your own experience. And it's important to not invalidate that experience that you have and the experience that you bring to the table. The next piece is apologizing. And this sounds counterintuitive, but it's apologizing specifically for white people in general and expressing your guilt. Unless you are being called out for a specific harm that you caused, that you specifically perpetuated, it doesn't make sense for y'all to apologize. It doesn't make sense to apologize for white people as a community. It doesn't make sense to express your guilt and say that you're a terrible person for all of these wrongs that have been perpetuated. It detracts from the conversation at hand, which is, what are we going to do better? How are we going to move forward? And there's no way that you can take responsibility for all of the social ills that have happened between now and since forever. And so really it's almost like it's a nondescript blanket statement. It doesn't mean anything, and it's performative more than it is effective. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. This last piece is actually very powerful too, is that when you recenter the conversation this way, the person you're speaking with is either forced to accept your apology or attempt to appease your guilt. And so the intention should never be to just have someone accepting what you're saying, it's to actually have a dialogue about it. The second to last piece here, our little final notes, is that while this list was created from the particular person, Celia Stanton's, and other Black folk experience with white women, it's also important to think about how some of these items are also relevant to any of us in dialogue about oppressive systems that we benefit from. And so this goes back to intersectionality, as we've talked about. The intersectionality component of this is that while we talk about this in tandem with white women, what we are also missing if we only focus on white women and white men and whiteness in general is that we can actually all perpetuate these things against one another. A component of Latinx identity, unfortunately, is anti-Blackness. There is a component of Latinidad or Latinx identities that look at values associated with skin color. And so you will notice what they call classism. So typically folks that are of a lower caste tend to be more indigenous, tend to be darker, tend to have a darker skin complexion, and those who are wealthier, those who are of a higher caste, tend to be wealthier, and they have a lighter skin complexion, and they have more education, and they live in nicer areas. All of these things which are reflective of systemic racism. And so if I were to go back to Mexico and have this conversation with someone, it would be very likely that someone would say, oh no, that's not racism, it's about class, and that has nothing to do with racism, but they are inherently connected. And that's one of the pieces here that feels so valuable to name. I can be racist and classist and all of these things because I have this privilege that I refuse to acknowledge as it applies to other people. And that's kind of the final note, but this is the piece that I enjoy the most in this context, where many folks will report feeling some iteration of this. Honestly, I'm at the point where I don't want an ally because that implies that you don't see yourself in the struggle or that you have nothing to gain from Black liberation, when in reality, everybody benefits from Black liberation. And really what this reflects is the comment earlier, how we all struggle and we all suffer under white supremacy. It does no one any favors, and it creates hierarchies and systems that are actually inherently oppressive to a number of communities. Whenever we talk about racism and we talk about the difficulties that people face, we also notice that communities who identify as white, who are living below the poverty line or who are struggling with disability concerns, they will often come and say, well, how can I be privileged on the basis of being white? And really, it's not talking about whiteness as the only measurement of privilege. It's talking about privileged identities as compared to other things. And when you live in a circumstance that utilizes white supremacy as the gold standard, there are many ways in which any of us, even if we are white, will not measure up to that standard, and we're still disenfranchised by that expectation. All right, I've been talking for quite a bit, so now we're at tools and skills. I'm going to stop here and give folks an opportunity to check in if they have any questions.
Where does the concept of repatriations fit into this discussion about indigenous people, the slaves, this type of, how does it fit into this conversation? Is that intent, or I'm sorry, but I didn't mean to run over your foot, but I did?
Did you say reparations, Neil?
Yes.
Yes. So reparations is a great question in terms of response. And so I would say that there are some ways in which reparations can be done, and there are systemic ways to do that, and then there's interpersonal ways to do that. One of the ways in which that works and can be looking at social advocacy. Often social advocacy and social justice initiatives can be considered one element of reparations. And another instrument of reparation is policy. So for example, when marijuana became legal, for example, so when cannabis became legal in the state of Oregon, there was a huge push to have folks that had been incarcerated prior to this date to have them released, especially if they were for something that was a nonviolent possession crime or something related to that. And so that would have been considered an iteration of reparations. So to answer your question, reparations actually fits at every stage in the process. It fits at a personal or interpersonal level. It fits at a systemic level, and it even fits at like a policy or federal level. And that can be considered a lot of different things. It just depends on the way in which it is implemented. Does that kind of make sense?
Well, I think that I really have a question. Is it sometimes done just because it feels good to do it, but not really any other reason, but it feels good?
Yeah, and that's what we would call performative, right? We just do it because it feels good to do it. But it could also be a system where even if it feels like we're just doing it to look good, like I've seen diversity initiatives at an institutional level just happen because it looks good to have a diversity initiative. But even then, even if it's not done well, it sets a precedent for how that initiative can then develop. It might not be considered a reparation, so to speak, because it's not necessarily giving back to the community that's been damaged at the time. But when we think about performative allyship versus intentional allyship, we look at how to take performative allyship behaviors and turning them into authentic or real and intentional allyship behaviors. And so reparations fits into that narrative when it becomes intentional, when it becomes with a purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have another question.
Yeah.
Samantha, could you speak a little bit about the connection that you see or don't see between white women living in a inherently sexist society and the rise of racist behavior in white women?
Yes. Thank you, Sarah. I love that you've brought that complexity and nuance. So something that we can talk about that often comes with what we might call the oppressions is internalized oppression. So with folks that are, we'll speak specifically to white women who maybe live in a higher sexism iteration of society. So internalized sexism is the transition between someone recognizing that what's occurring is sexist and internalizing this as the right thing or the more appropriate thing that they experience. So for example, if I lived in a society that didn't value women and perceived women as just baby makers, and like that's all we did, and that internalized sexism got to me to the point where any other woman that I encountered that was not doing that job, I would perceive as, insert phrase here, a hussy, someone who, isn't living a biblical life or isn't doing their due diligence. That application can create a lot of problems. And if we go back to that image, that Venn diagram of culture, norms, and beliefs, those actually can create a microcosm. And that microcosm can have significant, almost like ripple effects. And so you see that actually in places that have had less access to education, less access to knowledge, less access to experience other folks. And so whenever that internalization happens, and it happens to all of us, we all have internalized something. Whenever that iteration occurs and we don't have the tools to address it, we also find ourselves in the unfortunate position of perpetuating that. So if I, for example, going back to the sexism example, if I perceived myself as someone who was really only good for procreating, then anyone in my social circle, anyone in my age cohort that chose to not do that, I might engage in behaviors of slut shaming. I might engage in behaviors of talking badly about that person for wanting to achieve, academic goals. I might engage in some of the same oppressive behaviors because I myself have internalized what my role is and what my responsibility is. So that's how that relationship exists. Does that answer your question, Sarah?
Yes, thank you. I sort of tend to see it as shrinking pieces of the same pie.
Yeah.
And if you only get a teeny tiny piece to begin with, you certainly are not interested in sharing that piece. And it becomes a zero-sum game instead of a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a good way to look at it. Yeah, because I'm not interested in sharing my pie, and I make it about my tiny sliver of pie when the real question is, why did that other guy get the rest of the pie? Why can't he share his pie? Great example. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You just mentioned, you touched on where we would find characteristics of what Sarah was mentioning, the experience and everything. You mentioned that we might find this in areas of less opportunities, less education, et cetera. And I'm wondering if what you are drilling down to is the classic rural versus urban issue in some cases. And I only mention that because as a geographer and looking at political geography and studying voting patterns and voting theory and where do people follow, there's very true and given data about rural and urban voting patterns.
Yeah. That's a
And where does that play in this? Or is that just a stereotype? I mean, I'm talking general patterns here, not, oh, this is how it is. But is that even a valid point?
I think that in some ways it is, and in other ways, so speaking to what you said, the idea of it being a general pattern is factually undeniable. There are factual components, and the literature suggests that there are significant effects between being in a rural area where you have less access to a number of different opportunities. And when we look at urban spaces, we often see a higher concentration of people and a greater disbursement. So we see a lot of different perspectives created across a significant number of folks. And so those spaces, because we're looking at a numbers game, because there's so many more folks in urban areas than there are in rural areas, if we were to break it down by numbers, we might actually find a much less disproportionate distribution. And so really what most social psychologists have found is that it really boils down to experience, knowledge, and engagement. Those are the three big ones, where if we have experience of other folks, if we're exposed to them on a daily basis, it becomes a part of our schema of what is normal and what is okay and what we can engage with on a day-to-day. And if we have knowledge about the community and we have knowledge about how their systems work and how their lives are, and if that's integrated into our own experience. And then lastly, if we have the education on it, so if we're taught about their identities and taught about their experiences in a way that's non-punitive and doesn't other them and makes them a totally different version of us, if we're able to see them as people, but also acknowledge their experiences as just differing from ours, that's usually the most powerful way to get folks to not have that significant distribution.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question, Sam.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just kind of thinking about performative allyship, and then also the reference to make sure that we're in our right lane.
Yeah.
How kind of the work of this group, the Thursday Conversation Series, how can we best stay in our lane?
That's such a great question. I think that when it comes to having faith and offering faith to a wide community, we're looking at staying in our lane, meaning that you use your faith to support, you use your faith to create an inclusive environment, you use your faith to offer respite in many ways, offer space to people who are struggling and who are feeling like they are not being heard and supported. Staying in your lane, or what it would look like to come out of your lane may look more like doing things that y'all are not doing, which means like speaking on behalf of communities that you have no business speaking on behalf of. It may look like saying that you know all and that your personal relationship with a deity is what dictates what's right and wrong. Those are iterations of where you might find yourself deviating from your lane. But remaining in your lane can look like a lot of different activism. So even something like this, where we're having a conversation about a difficult topic, we find ourselves in the process of not just having a performative allyship relationship, but we look at ourselves in the circumstances of having difficult conversations. One of the things that you'll see as we move forward in terms of like, where do we go from here? What are our next steps? This is one of them, having the conversation, having difficult conversations, holding difficult spaces for those conversations, and hopefully influencing people to walk away with a better understanding of what can be done. And I would say that if you wanted to stay in your lane, it's important to know that getting out of your lane usually requires some iteration of telling people what to do, telling people what they shouldn't be feeling, telling people that their experiences should be discounted or invalidated. And it looks at stepping away from the person-centered to the problem solving when you don't know what that person's experience is. So I'll go back to what Murphy said earlier. When you focus on the human and the humanistic component, and you focus on what their life experience is, and your intention is to support them and maybe even guide them if they ask for guidance, you will be staying in your lane.
Yeah, yeah. And then, and helping as a white person with white privilege, talking to other white people about white supremacy, white power, and the history of racism that was told not accurately, for the goal or purpose or intent of creating an awareness so that way people understand the truth. That's in our lane, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If I cross over and start talking about how racism really is, I mean, if I get too far off of the negative impact of how it impacts Black people or Asians, then that's obviously, I can't experience, that's not my experience. So, okay.
Yeah, you could very easily speak to other white folks, and actually someone might say that that's the destination, right? To continue having these difficult conversations with other white folks. I would even say that if you were to reflect and disseminate information about how racism affects other people, I would actually offer that that's still in your lane. I think the only way to get out of your lane is by saying that my knowledge actually is superior to that of folks that are actually living the experience. There's no problem with reporting on data. There's no problem with being critical of data. Actually, we encourage critical discussion around data all the time. It's when you utilize your voice to overshadow or overpower other folks' experience.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, y'all, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I'm looking at how we have about 15 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly go over some of these tools and skills. And what I might do is I might offer one question for discussion at the end. So that way we have an opportunity to share the space together, but also to make sure that I don't skimp on the good parts, which is like the tools and skills and where we go from here. So looking at this particular component, I'm going to introduce something called the LACE framework. So the LACE framework is a model for connecting folks with connecting people with values to bring about change. So LACE stands for love, acceptance, courage, and authenticity. It was actually developed by Dr. Yvette Alex Asenso, who is a law professor at the University of Oregon. And so with this framework, change is not a checklist or a plan, but it's a lifestyle and intention. And it's by connecting the head with the heart, anti-racism and other forms of anti-oppression, and it becomes who we are. And again, it comes with this idea of living your values. Hopefully these are values that we all share and that we can all unite with to move forward and figure out what's the next best step. And so really, how does it work? Well, it facilitates change at 3 different levels. So self-awareness, connection, which is also building community, and transformation, which is organizational change. And so that might sound really familiar because we have our head, heart, and hands. And so our head is the self-awareness piece. We have our heart, which is the connection and building community. And we have our hands, the transformation or the praxis component of this. And so this is how we implement it. Here's why it matters. So here are some guidelines guidelines for being strong white allies. When we look at uprooting racism, how white people can work for social justice, I'm going to give two components here. We're going to have the things that folks of color are asking for and the ways in which we can rise to the occasion to meet them. So what do Black, Indigenous, people of color want from what allies? We want respect. We want to be listened to. We want folks to not make assumptions. We want folks to stand by us, to offer resources, to take risks, to make mistakes, to not take things personally, to interrupt jokes and comments, to teach your children about racism. We want a lot of different things, but many of them come from this idea of walking the walk and not just talking the talk. This last one actually is one that particularly feels salient for me, putting my body on the line, standing with my community members and wanting to be with them and to support them when the going gets tough. And so how do we do that? What are some basic tactics we can offer? I'm going to zoom through these, but you'll have these when you get the slides. But the first one is assuming racism is everywhere and every day. Notice who is at the center of attention and who is at the center of power. Notice how racism is denied, minimized, and justified. Understand connections between racism, economic issues, sexism, and other forms of injustice. Again, intersectionality, that's a big one for this. Understanding and learning from the history of whiteness and racism. So again, maybe going back to some of those history books and learning about the intersectionality that was never reported on. Taking a stand against injustice, even when, and especially when it's scary, difficult, or brings up feelings of inadequacy, indecision, or fear. Sometimes making a mistake and demonstrating the vulnerability and willingness to make that mistake is such a huge distinction for folks of color who are struggling to do that very thing every single day. Being strategic, knowing when it's important to challenge and when it's not confusing the battle with the war. This is a hard one. So knowing that racism is flexible and adaptable and that there's going to be gains and losses in the struggle for justice and equality. So knowing when to fight the battle and when it will benefit the war, so to speak. This one's obvious, no name calling or being personally abusive. So this is also when you're having these difficult conversations with other people. It may feel really gratifying to just call someone an idiot, a racist, and a bigot and get it over and done with. But ultimately that doesn't accomplish the goal of helping folks grow and helping folks realize the ways in which they're perpetuating harm. So really taking it upon yourself to have these difficult conversations in a meaningful way. Supporting leadership of people of color. And this component here is actually really important. Do this consistently, but not uncritically. Folks of color are not asking for uncritical support. We're asking to be held accountable. We're asking to be held to the same standards that you would hold your politicians, that you would hold your other leaders and other administrators of justice. We don't want blind loyalty. We want to be held accountable to doing the work because we can all fall off the bandwagon, so to speak, and we can all struggle to remain on our path to justice and to support justice. Learning and teamwork. This is another favorite of mine. So something that we can do is learn about the history of white people who have worked for racial justice. There's a lot of folks that are white that have worked for racial justice. Know who they are, teach who they are, and see if there's something that they've done that you can be like them in. And don't do it alone. This is not something that you're going to end by yourself. This group is a perfect example of how we can all learn together and how we can learn in tandem and learn from one another. What are you doing to support this? How could I also do that? Or how could I do an iteration of that? Is a valuable skill. And also what a valuable way to build community, to know that you are working with community members that share your values and also want to support in the same way that you are. And then last but certainly not least, talk to your children and other young people about racism. And I would amend this, talk to your grandmas, talk to your grandpas, talk to your aunts, couples, cousins, talk to your next door neighbors, talk to anybody that you care about, and maybe even some people you don't care about that much. Be willing to engage in that conversation because it is so valuable. And this last piece, and I can't stress this enough, taking responsibility for your words, your actions, your choices, and your thoughts. And this is probably the sweetest part, at least for me, to recognize that I can also be kinder to myself, that remember that the first thought you think is actually what you're conditioned to think by society, culture, and family. But the second thought and the action that you subsequently choose to take is your responsibility. And those are the things that you choose to do. Those are the things that you choose to do with the thoughts and with the new knowledge that you have. And so I'm going to bump us right to discussion. So I have 4 questions, but I think we maybe only have time for one. And so I think the one that I would be most interested in hearing from y'all about is going to be, let's see. So this is the first one. So what was the first time you realized you were white or might have been treated differently because you have white skin? I get the sense that y'all have already had a conversation about whiteness and what that experience is like for you. The next one is like the most important image, encounter, or whatever you've had regarding race, and maybe even feeling threatened as a minority, or have you felt privileged? But again, I feel like many of these conversations we've talked around or we've actually engaged in them at some point. So I'm actually interested in the 4th one. What are you most intimidated by in this process, and how can I help move forward? How can I help us have this conversation? How can I help us engage in these concepts a little more thoroughly? And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to put that quote and put that comment in the chat, so that way we can all look at each other and respond to it.
I was just starting to do that. You went off screen. So please do put that in the chat. And everyone unmute yourselves, please, so that you can participate. Because that question is what I have been thinking about as you've been talking. So what are you most intimidated by in this process?
Art?
And how can she help?
Okay, I'll let you decide. You make your own choice.
Well, I have one.
Bobby?
Yes, I have one. I've been thinking about it lately, and that is if I'm in a situation where there is, remember when you had all those lists of people saying, oh, for a devil's advocate and this and that and this and that, and I'm sitting there and there's a person of color and there's a colleague and a white colleague both in the room, and the white person says one of those and like, I recognize it. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I'm me, so I'll probably say something, but you know, because I don't want to be a racist supporter. You know, I mean, I don't want to be a white solidarity kind of thing. I want to be able to speak out, but I also don't want to step over someone, a person of color, and like be step on what he or she may want to say. And I'm kind of intimidated, even though I don't know when that would come up. I just feel like, well, what do you do in those kind of situations where you don't want to? Yeah.
I love that. I love that you're bringing up the complexity and nuance of interpersonal experiences, especially challenging ones. I'll share with you my favorite, what I call interrupter, because sometimes, again, we think about silence as complicity and like, I want to say something, but I don't know what to say. And I also don't want to infantilize this person and act as though they can't speak for themselves. And so something that I usually default to is, that's really not helpful. I like to offer that. When someone says something that I find rude or I find microaggressive, I'll say, I don't find that very helpful, or that wasn't very helpful. Or if they say something that is really problematic, sometimes I want to know where that's coming from. And I'll say, I don't understand that. Could you explain that a little bit more? Because it forces them to engage with whatever they've said. And it forces them to acknowledge that, you know, there might actually be some problematic pieces that's happening in that conversation. And so really those interrupters are and other iterations. I have a racial literacy program that I work with. Those are called comeback lines, racial comeback lines. And so there's a lot of ways to implement them, whether it's, I don't agree with that, or that seems problematic to me, or I don't like that you said that. Can you explain more? All of those are effective interrupters that puts the ball in their court, and it doesn't allow their phrase or their statement to go by unacknowledged. And so there's a lot of ways to do that without centering yourself and making it about you. It's more about like, I actually didn't like that you said that, or that seems incorrect. That seems inaccurate. Can you tell me more about why you think that's the case? Those are ways of asking. It's expressing curiosity. And one might even call it, instead of confrontation, we'll call it carefrontation, asking them to clarify, but with care.
Thank you.
Yeah. Comeback interrupters. Yeah, I'll include the resource that I have on that. It's a slide from one of my racial literacy pieces. They're a lot of fun, and they're especially fun to practice.
I think Bobby kind of reminded me of something that has bothered me for a good part of my life. I was in the Oregon legislature for 15 years, and I worked in corrections and helped write the Community Corrections Act. One of the things that I did during that time was tour the corrections facilities in Minnesota, which had a really good first-rate community corrections program, and we wanted to see what they had. Oregon had just passed a law which made the possession of marijuana a violation, which was a $20 fine. And so I was touring the prison in Stillwater in Minnesota, which is rather notorious. And I met this young kid, and that's all he was. He wasn't even 18 years old. And he was serving 14 years for possession of marijuana. And I didn't think at that time, this is now approaching 50 years ago, and I didn't think about it as being a racist thing, but I thought the law was so unequal. And, now, there's a whole lot of other implications to that. But I'm just kind of wondering if anyone has experienced something in their lives where, as they look back on it, you think you'd either do it differently, or perhaps you have more information now, or perhaps you understand the situation differently than you did when it originally occurred, and what your response would be today. I'm quite sure I'd be leaping in with all fours with it today, but it just sort of broke your heart when I saw this young man, and I could still see him in my mind. I could almost draw a sketch of him, and I don't know, have no clue about whatever happened to him, how his life turned out, but I thought it was just so unequal, and also it kind of leads me to wonder, as we talk about all of this, what state boundaries have to do with where we are. So I thought I'd throw that out.
Sam, you said something that intrigued me. I love your optimism when you talk about anybody can learn. I've always believed that until recently, but we're going through a cycle where society seems so polarized. If you can have 70 million people who believe that the election was stolen, it doesn't bode well. The physical possibility that all can learn doesn't seem to be supported by a very high probability that they actually will. And I despair at how to deal with that polarization about race and many other things in our society.
Boy, Martin, that was just the elephant in the room right there.
Yeah, a lot of them are elephants, I have to admit.
And you have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, Martin, I really appreciate that. You've had several really interesting and I think things that draw on complexity and nuance. And I hear ya. I hear the echo of that despair in a lot of communities, especially in communities of color. And I'll be transparent and say that my clinical experience includes a lot of populations that otherwise would not have been afforded the same hopefulness. The core of my experience is actually with folks who are incarcerated for domestic violence and also for sexual abuse perpetrations. And so I've had a lot of opportunity to work with folks who are usually considered the unredeemables, right? The folks that no change can be seen, no help can be offered, nothing can be given to make those situations any better. And because of that experience, I would say that in some ways I have a unique perspective, and that is that hurt people hurt people. And that's something that we've seen over and over and over again. And so when we are thinking about these 70 million folks that believe that the election was stolen, I see a community that has been offered something and is hopeful for whatever that something is, even though it hasn't been given. I see a community that is wanting something and is hoping that this administration would have given it to them and is holding out for that promise of something. And in many ways, humans are nothing if not hopeful creatures. We really want to hold on to some semblance of hope, the light at the end of the tunnel. And it's really what makes us one of the most tenacious, capable, and quite frankly, existentially present beings on the face of the planet, because we have the ability to look ahead, to think about the capacity of better things existing in our world and holding out for that. Our ability to stomach and to withstand things is so strong that sometimes we kind of kill ourselves to the point of searching for it. And honestly, that's what I see. That's what I see in these communities that are unwilling to accept something, because the idea of having invested so much in a false hope is so painful that it's almost like go big or go home, right? Like I'm going to invest in it till the end. I see that in folks who suffer from dependence on like gambling, or they experience a gambling difficulty because the idea of giving up and kind of throwing in the towel would mean that there's no way to redeem themselves. And there's so many iterations of that across substance use, across substance dependence, across value engagement, across things that have happened in our history that are so negative and awful, that many folks are willing to dig their heels in and stand their ground, because admitting that they were wrong kind of derails their entire existence. And it's not something that they think they can stand.
Makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
Maybe
Ms. Samantha Martinez, ladies and gentlemen, let's give her a big digital.
Yes.
Thank you. You hit the ball out of the park. Very, very good. I think it was a fascinating presentation, excellent visuals, and I wish we had more time, but we are true to our clock. And Sam, thank you very much. Excellent.
Great job.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It was so great to be here with y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see most of you next week.
All right.
Sammy, hang around a minute.
I will.
Bye.
Go back to the blue room, Sam.
Blue room, I like that.
We'll see you in the blue room.
It's only green room when you're in person.
That's right. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Great seeing you.